Okay, so let's talk about what racism is. Okay. So racism in itself, if we're going to talk about what it is, it's basically about power. Right? When it comes down to it, it's about power. It's about power to control, to create identity, to control ideology. It's about giving access or taking away access to resources. And it's done in several different ways. If we look at like individual racism, this is where an individual will act in a negative way against someone else based upon their race, or it can also be not acting in a way that could be detrimental to somebody, right? Not acting. What does that mean? Well, that say you see something happening that is racist, or that you could have an impact on that could be positive, but instead choose to not act, and something bad happens because of somebody's race, right? So that can be seen as individual racism as well. So acting against someone that creates a negative impact, or not taking action that could lead to a positive impact. And some people might be like, well, I'm not a racist, but I don't act or not act. Well, the definitions here are what they are, and nobody's perfect, right? So there can also be things like microaggressions, and this is where sort of the unconscious aspect of a lot of racism comes into play. People will do things that don't seem overtly racist, don't seem to be that important, that dramatic, but can have that big impact on a community. Such as, say you're a little old white lady sitting in her car, parked on the side of the road, and you've got a couple of black guys that come walking by. And because these two black guys are walking by, she locks her car door, right? The likelihood of them doing anything to her are so astronomically remote. But she has this fear, right, that something could happen. So she locks her door. And these two black guys notice it, right? They notice it. They weren't aggressively attacked. They weren't yelled at. She might not have said a single thing. Nobody really noticed. It wasn't that big of a deal. But it kind of is. And the concept here is that there's an old saying that 1,000 cuts can kill. Right? So let's say you get like a tiny little paper cut. Right? You're not going to die from a paper cut. Right? The likelihood is really, really slim. In fact, you might even get like 5 or 10 paper cuts. And yeah, that's going to really suck. But you're probably going to survive. If you were to get 1,000 paper cuts, you might just die. Right? You might just bleed out from 1,000 different cuts. Well, the concept is the same when it comes to microaggressions. It's this idea that if you have all these little things, all these little constant things that don't seem all that bad, but they have an impact, right? It's the little old lady that locks the door. It's being followed through a department store, right? It's not getting as fast of service when going to a restaurant, right? And it's all based on these ideas about what this person might do. As an example, let's say that there's a stereotype against black people that don't tip very well. They don't tip at a restaurant very well. And you've got a waitress or a waiter that comes up and seats them, but thinks that, they're probably not going to tip me very well. And so I'm probably not going to serve them as well as I might some of these other families that are here. And so they go about and they do their stuff, and this black family that might be there, they don't get seated as quickly. They might not get their menus as quickly. They might not get their food as quickly. Their food might be a little cold, And then when the waiter or waitress comes back up and collects the bill, their tip is smaller, right? Because their service wasn't very good. But you see sort of the pattern here, right? There's a reinforcement of this stereotype of one particular group behaving a certain way, and then it gets reinforced because of bad behavior. So we see these stereotypes taking place, and they can seem small, right? They're not overtly racist, right? You're not calling somebody names, or you're not committing acts of violence. They're the small things. And these small things have a huge impact, and can have a huge impact over time. Now, if we talk about something like institutional racism is, or structural racism as it's sometimes called, is this system in which various entities such as the government or education or healthcare or the police or anyone else can have racist dealings or have racial impacts on a community that isn't often seen, right? It isn't often dealt with. There might be long-lasting impacts that might not be visible today. And this is a very real thing that we are experiencing right now. And it's because of institutional racism that we see a lot of the injustices taking place, especially if we're talking about prisons, incarceration, police, even banking, and all kinds of stuff, even access to food, to good quality health care and stuff like that. These are all institutional problems that are still impacting us. So, for example, I'm going to talk about housing. So, in 1968, we had the Fair Housing Act. So, prior to 1968, if you owned a home and you were trying to sell it, you could discriminate against the buyers, right? So, if you were living in a neighborhood and you had a black family come in, right? You're living in a white neighborhood and you have a black family come in and they wanted to buy your house, you could say no. They might have cash in hand. They might have more than the asking price. But you could say, you know what, I'm not going to sell to you because I don't want to see a black family in this neighborhood. And other people in this neighborhood don't want to see you here, so we're not going to sell to you. So it was legal to do that up until 1968. And then in a lot of other states, even after this was passed, didn't necessarily ratify it. And so even into the early 70s, there were still communities that were denying people from moving into these neighborhoods because of their color or their nationality or ethnicity. It was legal well, in some places it was still legal to do it because they hadn't ratified it yet. And then when it did become ratified, when it was finally to the point where you couldn't discriminate against someone, there were loopholes that were created, such as HOAs. Now, some of you might live in an HOA or have lived in an HOA, and I personally hate HOAs. I hate HOAs mostly because I don't want them to tell me how I want to live or what I can decorate my front yard as, or put my windows, or if I want to have some junky cars out in my driveway, I want some junky cars, right? And I don't want some neighborhood association telling me that I can't. But HOAs, when they were originally constructed, had this intent that people still wanted to exclude people from coming into their neighborhoods. So they would basically create these closed gate neighborhoods and had very strict policies on who they would let in. And oftentimes it would be done in a way that would exclude somebody based on income or based on some other aspect in which it might be out of the reach of a lot of families that contain people of color, right? So the housing became a big issue. Now, why is housing so important? Well, within the United States, one of the main ways that we transfer wealth from generation to generation is through home ownership, right? So if your great-grandparents, they buy a house and then, they die and pass that house on to their kids, and then they sell it and then give that money to the grandkids, they're passing down wealth one generation to the next. And this is huge, right? This is one way that that families gain wealth is through owning property, right? Owning a house. It's one way that you can invest over years towards buying something, and then you can take that and sell it and invest it in something else. Well, when you are restricted from buying homes in certain areas, right? If all you have access to is poor areas where housing doesn't gain any, doesn't accumulate any value, or you're forced to live in the projects or in an area of town where you can't buy anything, you have to rent, right? Well, you can't grow value, right? Economic value if you're renting. All that money goes to someone else. So, if you can buy a home, you build that equity into yourself, and then you can, even if you don't own the house or pay off the house, you can sell it and get some of that equity back and use it for something else. But you're constantly building, it's constantly building upon itself. If you're renting or you're forced to rent, you can't do that. And this is what was done intentionally to a lot of communities that contain people of color. The spaces that were available for living were not great places to live in the first place. Some of these communities were placed where a lot of communities that engage that have poverty as a big part of them are oftentimes located near areas that aren't safe to live in. So near factories or polluted areas. Where there might be a lot of like railroads, and so you're going to have lots of noise pollution and that kind of pollution as well. So you've got all of this stuff that's now impacting these communities. So And that's only, 50 years ago. So, but these laws have been put into place, so things should be equal now, right? No, again, because we also have to understand that change takes time to be implemented. So that even when those communities were no longer being excluded to that, most of these communities, you couldn't discriminate against who was moving in. It still takes a while to build up that equity to go buy that house, right? And there's other complications as well. Because of discrimination and segregation and all of this stuff, getting a good job, right? And getting fair pay, right? That's also an impact. So you're earning less, trying and struggling more to get to that equal position of being able to, buy a home and do all of that stuff. So you've got all these other things that are, sort of compounding themselves. And each of these things are oftentimes unseen, right? We don't hear about this because it's not something that's intentional. If you were to go to a bank and ask to get a mortgage, right? This is still something that happens today, right? There is, in this country, there are people that are discriminated against, sometimes unconsciously, based on their names. Okay, wait a second. How does that work? Well, if you have an ethnic sounding name, if you have a name that might be hard to pronounce to the average American, right? If it isn't John or Bill or Joe, right? Some people have a hard time pronouncing certain names. So if they're not used to it, they will sometimes select people that they think they'll have an easier time getting along with if they can pronounce their name. So getting a job in this country is harder to do if you have an ethnic sounding name. I mean, it seems ridiculous, but it's absolutely true. So, these are all things that are hidden. These are all things that, you don't expect to see, you don't expect to experience, but experience it just the same. Okay, so we're going to talk about an exercise. So there's going to be 4 questions. We're talk about 3 of them here real quick. And I just want you to take one of these and write about it in the discussion. And then post on 2 other people's discussions as well. The first question being, how does institutional racism take place in today's society? Pick a subject, pick a group. I'll have some examples here in a minute that you can talk about. What are some of the institutions that continue this practice, right? So, and then what are some of the consequences that have come about because of institutionalized racism? What are some of the consequences that people are experiencing now? And there's lots and lots of examples. If we talk about these various examples, there's employment rates, right? Again, it's how, even like people's names can have an influence on who gets hired to do what. Income disparity, right? Who gets paid more? And that's also a gendered issue as well, right? Men make more money than women do, even if they're doing the exact same job. Home ownership. So like home ownership rates, who owns the majority of houses in this country, and who has access to those houses, and then who can gain access to mortgages and loans from the bank. Residential patterns, right? Where do people live? Where have they been forced to live? What happens with gentrification? If you look at like 5 Points and Rhino, in Denver, you've got areas right now that are being gentrified because the how expensive houses are getting in this area. And those areas are right next to downtown. And all of a sudden, the value of those houses are skyrocketing. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, you could buy a house in 5 Points, even 20 years ago, for $20,000, you know, and it might be a rundown shack, but it was still $20,000. Now that same house in the same condition would go for $400,000. And people are seeing that and going like, man, that's a steal. I'm going to buy that. But who's buying it, right? Again, who's got access to that money? You know, who's coming here? And you get gentrification. So you're forcing people out because they can no longer afford to live in those areas, either paying rent or even just paying taxes on their homes. As the values go up, those tax numbers go up as well. So you might have to spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 in taxes a year just on owning a house. And you might not be able to afford that. And so you end up having to move. Criminal sentencing patterns. Yeah. And this is a holdover from slavery times. This is a real thing that's taking place. And criminal sentencing patterns, we see more incarceration for people of color. Death penalty, you know, people that face the death penalty are oftentimes have a higher percentage of being people of color. Infant mortality, you know, kids being born with issues or you know, being stillborn. Again, people of color have more incidences of this than white people. Access to health care. You know, one of the interesting things that has happened, and it's not interesting, it's horrific, is that people of color in this country have never really received good health care. And there are examples that if we go back even into the 1920s, 1930s, where in places like Kentucky, Louisiana, the government, in some cases various counties or towns, were forcibly sterilizing women and men as well from having kids without their knowledge, right? And we just had an incident of that in one of these internment camps, right? Refugee camps, whatever you want to call them, where some women were forcibly sterilized. They didn't know what was happening. And all of a sudden they find out that now they can't have kids. Well, this was done to, you know, various populations in the South in this past century. So that creates also a sense of fear about going to healthcare, you know, going to the hospital, you know, going to see a doctor, because that doctor might not treat you, you know, in a positive way, in a healthy way. Life expectancy is lower for people of color. Education, access to good education. This is also a huge institutional issue that, you know, that we'll take, for instance, so the way that some school districts are set up. So in some cases, to get funding for your school has to meet a certain criteria. You have to have like a certain GPA, like an average GPA for that student body. If you do not meet that GPA requirement, or whatever those requirements are, you will not get the funding. So if you are in a historically impoverished community that does not have access to the kind of resources that set up good places for education, guess what happens? You know, education falters. And if that school, you know, doesn't meet those standards, then they don't get that extra funding. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to education, if you want to improve education, you usually throw some money at it for better classrooms, for better books, for more experienced teachers, for all of these different things that make education better. So if you wanted to discriminate against a community, one of the ways that you might do it without raising a whole lot of alarms is by doing it by getting on the school board and denying access. So that's one way that institutional racism can come into place. Higher education is also another place. Fortunately, you look at schools like Metro and CCD that are very diverse, and they encourage diversity in so many great ways, which is what makes them such great schools. But there are plenty of other universities that don't have that capability to encourage diversity, that exclude and sometimes even price themselves out of access, right? Sometimes all you can afford is to go to a community college, because again, we see so many people that end up living in poverty that the only thing that they can do is go to a community college. So we see sort of discriminatory practices in higher education as well. And then you've got stuff like, hi Bear, hi, yes, well, you're going to have to wait, okay? Yes, you're a good boy. You're a good boy. You're just going to have to wait. So then you've got stuff like accessibility to vote, and how in certain areas that can be, you can have certain districts gerrymandered, or you can have accessibility to areas to vote. So it's not uncommon to restrict certain areas from having accessible locations. So like ballot drop-off locations. So, normally most cities and most states have multiple places where you can drop off a ballot. In cases like what's happening in Texas, where the governor was like, we're going to have one ballot drop-off location per county. Well, if you live in a county that has like 10,000 people, that's actually not terrible, because there's only 10,000 people there. But if you live in a county that's got 400,000 people and you have one ballot drop-off location, and we see that in urban areas, there are more people of color that live there, and that, if you have one location, it might restrict people that are age, that have issues with age, or they might be too old, or they might not have access to driving around or going to certain locations. Yeah, there's lots of issues with eliminating that, and it can be done based on this idea of preventing the vote, right? Of preventing accessibility. So these are all tactics that are oftentimes used against people of color to, prevent them from using their voice and to casting their vote. And believe me, when you think about in the past how people of color have oftentimes not voted in a lot of elections, oftentimes it's been done in a way that is, they don't feel like their vote counts, or they've been scared off from voting because of voter intimidation. I mean, these are all real subjects that even, here in Colorado and here in Denver, we might not see a whole lot of that. Denver itself is pretty tame for the most part. We've got a bad history in Denver, but contemporary Denver's, it's way better than what it used to be. But if you live in areas that there's still a lot of racism going on, then yeah, that can become a huge issue. So where there is a suppression, and if you think about how in some of these close races that we've had in the last few decades, had more people of color voted, we might have seen some very different results. So, I encourage everyone, use your voice, go out and vote. It counts. It really does count, right? Your voice will be heard. So do it, okay? I'm getting off my soapbox there. Okay, so we got to talk about this other concept of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny, we can go back again to sort of early American history. And it's this idea that doesn't matter what happens or how it happens or who it happens to, this was going to happen. Okay. And in this case, it's about the conquering of the West, conquering of the United States, of North America, and it didn't matter the consequences. So that, say the church would ordain this process in which, the United States is going to expand itself from sea to shining sea. And in this process, it doesn't matter, how many people get killed or, what kind of suffering takes place. This was going to happen anyway, right? Doesn't matter. God ordained this, so it must be. And anything that happens that's just part of the deal, right? We had no control over that, right? We just knew that this was going to happen. And this is still happening today, right? This is still a concept that, no matter what, this was going to happen. And, and there's no consequences, it doesn't matter if there's any ill effect, it was going to happen. And this was a driving factor for the United States, especially when it came towards expansion, especially when it came towards, expanding west and gaining those resources, especially when gold was found in here in Colorado, and then also in California, and that you had this huge push to go west. It was meant to be ours as Americans. That gold was ours, and it didn't matter who got in the way. And that's kind of like what manifest destiny is. That this has come before us, and this is our destiny. And it doesn't matter how we get there. And so we have another topic here, racial ideology. Racial ideology is how we normalize behavior. Okay, it's how we normalize behavior. And what does that mean? So basically, it allows us to accept that, being racist or owning slaves is normal and acceptable, right? And we do this by reinforcing certain types of behavior. And kind of like when I was giving you the example of the waitress or waiter that was serving that family, right? That becomes basically sort of this ideology that normalizes a certain type of behavior. So, and this happens in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. An example would be, okay, so let's take the evening news. You're watching the news, and you hear this story about this white guy who murders his family. Okay, murders his family, and they show a picture of him on the news. What does he look like? Well, they're probably showing a picture of him standing with his wife, or maybe standing with his kids, and they might be out doing something fun, or they're in their backyard having a barbecue or something like that. And that's how a white man is portrayed as a murderer. If a black man were arrested for robbing a bank or getting pulled over and for drug charges or something like that, not even coming close to murder, how do they show the picture, right? What picture do they use? Oftentimes you'll see a mugshot, right? You'll see them in a mugshot. They'll be in their jail jumpers, right? And they'll be looking, disheveled because they've, been arrested, and all of a sudden you're getting this portrayal of somebody, right? We're seeing how somebody is being portrayed. And that becomes normalized. That behavior becomes consistently, repeatedly internalized. And so that every time we see that, it changes our mind. And it can change the impact on, say, like a trial, right? If you see somebody that, like a white guy that goes in front of a judge or a jury, and they're dressed, all nice, right? And they might have a suit on, and they look good. They look like a normal American, right? They look like a normal American. Or you get a person of color in there that doesn't have the access to, or even does, wear a nice suit and tie. All of a sudden, people have, because they've become, normalized to seeing this, their expectations change. Their behavior changes. And so you have an impact on the judicial system and convictions based solely on how we interpret things like the news, right? And what we see on a regular basis. So we can look at this kind of behavior, and it can be reinforced constantly, over and over again, wherever you go, whether it's in school, whether it's clothing, right? Whether it's religious institutions. I heard a great story recently on NPR that was talking about these African American families that had white Jesus, right, in their homes. They had a picture of Jesus there, and Jesus is portrayed as like, blue-eyed, blonde hair, Jesus. And in the historical record, if we look back at who Jesus actually was, not the portrayal that we find in the church, the likelihood of Jesus being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed individual is next to impossible. Right? Would never have looked like that. But that portrayal is so common within this society that it can have an impact, even just that, can have an impact on a family as an individual, and it becomes normalized. So we look at this, we look at all of these things that we're exposed to, and see how things can be normalized. And then how do we see things that are changing, right? And this is something that I find really important to discuss. And again, why I'm a Star Trek nerd. I mean, I freaking love Star Trek. You know, if you look at the original series, you know, back in the late 60s, what did they have? What was one of the most incredible aspects of that show? It was diverse. It was absolutely diverse. And all of a sudden, and I think this is the really important thing that kind of happens from shows like this, is that they start integrating this idea that differences don't have to matter, right? That, you know, the first interracial kiss on TV was Uhura and Captain Kirk, right? That was the first interracial kiss on TV. It was done through Star Trek. And so you have these events that can also change behavior, right? And that's why I love Star Trek. Star Trek's been at the lead of this for a long time. The first same-sex kiss between two women happened on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And you've got these different behaviors that all of a sudden start becoming, you know, normalized, that are becoming more acceptable, right? So there's definitely ways to change that ideology. But ideology does take influence, right? And when we see these negative impacts through media and through the newspaper or through education and these different things, law enforcement, you know, all of this stuff can create these ideologies that silently impact us. So, yeah, it's hidden, it's insidious, that these kinds of things can have such a massive impact on who we are and what we look at. If we look at some other issues dealing with this, and this is something that I find really important to kind of talk about, is this sort of, again, reaction to sort of like racial equality. And one of the things that, you know, some of the most non-racist people I've ever met, right? These, you know, don't have a racist bone in their body, right? But they might be looking at programs like affirmative action, and they might say, we don't need affirmative action anymore, right? Under the guise of all these laws, we're all equal, right? We're all considered equal. So why do we need to have affirmative action, which, you know, they say is like reverse racism against white people? And that's something that I just, I claim a whole lot of BS on. And the reason why I do that, because I don't believe in even the concept of reverse racism. Racism is racism. But what we're talking about here is that programs like affirmative action are designed to level out the playing field, right? Because the playing field is, you know, you got white people over here and you got people of color over here, and affirmative action's like, you know, trying to get that up here, you know. And that's the same way with gender too, gender and sexuality and all that stuff. It's getting it to that level playing field. But you can't level that playing field out until you actually get it level, which means that, you know, you have to build up underneath to lift this group up. And if that means that, you know, there's a few less jobs or a few less positions in a university over here, well, I guess I don't have a problem with that. You know, if companies and government entities are making space specifically for people of color or for women, or they are giving incentives to getting business loans to help them out, then yeah, I'm okay with that, and because I'm a white guy, I might not have that access. I've got a lot of other access and have had a lot of other access, dealing with a lot of this stuff that, I, I don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff. So it's important to continue to recognize that while under the law, yeah, things are equal, the actuality of it, right? And we've talked about this before, sort of the theoretical truth versus the ground truth. Theoretically, we're equal. But in reality, that ground truth is that we're not there yet. We're working on it, right? We're getting there, but we're not there yet. So we have to keep these programs in place to make sure that eventually there is equality, that everyone is on the same playing field. And then we can deal with all those other things, right? Because here's the thing, right? We are trying to live up to some pretty crazy ideals, right? We've got, as a society, as Americans, we have this belief that we should be a meritocracy. Meritocracy is basically saying, hey, I'm going to consider you based upon what you've accomplished in life. What is your merit, right? Have you done well in school? What's your work history like? Are you successful? And you're going to judge them on their merit. And that, I don't think that's a bad ideal, right? If everyone is going to be treated equal, then having it based on a meritocracy is not necessarily a bad thing. At the same time, it's completely unrealistic to sort of have this idealism, because a meritocracy is going to have to be based on equality, right? Everyone has the same jumping off point. Everyone starts at level 0 and then can move up to level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, right? And they can do it at their own pace, whether, how successful they are, but everyone starts out equally. But that isn't the case, right? You might have, families, people of color that are starting at level 0, but then you've got a white family right here that's starting at level 5, because they've already got resources, right? They've already got access to different schools and different things like that. And so those levels aren't equal yet. And the American dream is, I think, a really interesting thing to discuss, because we see how people are drawn to this country, right? They have these expectations. And this is why there's so many people that immigrate to the United States, is because they see the United States as this, wonderful land where anything can happen if you work hard enough to do it, right? If you work hard enough, you can accomplish anything. And it does. It brings a lot of people here. And there is some truth to that. Like, if you work hard enough and, you can accomplish just about anything. But where people start, right, and what they have access to can, not be equal. So we have to sort of look at these ideals, right? What are our ideals in this country? How do we accomplish them? And then where are they flawed? And in this case, like the American dream is, while idealistically a good dream, right? It's a good thing to try and strive for. In reality, it can be much harder for some to accomplish than others. So again, this idea of, theoretical truth, equality and stuff like that, versus ground truth where it's not quite there yet. And this brings us to another subject that this is oftentimes can be a difficult subject to cover, and it's mostly difficult for white men. So in previous classes that I've given this talk on, and we inevitably get to this point talking about white privilege, I end up getting into, a discussion with, usually it's a white guy who doesn't agree with what I'm stating here. Okay, and I understand why a lot of people would disagree with some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here. But what it comes down to is it's not about you. Okay, so we're going to talk about white privilege. So what is white privilege? So the way that I like to describe white privilege is not necessarily that white people have extra privileges. Okay, it's not about having extra things that they haven't earned, right? It's about normal things that they haven't earned. So it's, for example, when I'm driving, I don't have to worry about being pulled over because I'm white. Okay? If I'm shopping, I don't have to worry about being hassled by security because I'm white. If I'm applying for a bank loan, I don't have to worry about not getting that bank loan because I'm white. Right? These are all things that I have normalized, right? I go about my daily business without ever having to worry about anything bad happening to me. Right? This is just normal behavior. If I go out to a restaurant, I don't have to worry about not getting served as quickly or not getting my food at a slower pace. I can expect normal behavior. And that's what white privilege really is about. It's this concept of normal behavior. And when that normal behavior is no longer passed on to people of color, then that behavior becomes a privilege. Right? There's something that you are not getting. So white privilege, and it isn't about the individual, right? This has nothing to do with the individual. You might have grown up in a poor community. You might have grown up dirt poor, and you might not have experienced what a lot of other white families have experienced. I get it. I totally understand where you're coming from. At some point in your life, even if you didn't experience a lot of these privileges, you probably experienced something that would have been normal for every other white person out there to experience, but a person of color might not have, right? Might not have had that same experience. So it doesn't matter how you grew up, what your individual experience is. It does not mean that this isn't true and that you have not experienced it in some way. Some others may have experienced a lot more of it than you, right? Other communities and other families may have experienced a lot more of this normal, privileged behavior. But it's not about you, right? This is something that happens in general. Right? This is why it's about race and racism. So white privilege is something that is a reality. And the thing about white privilege is that, white people have to figure that out, right? They got to figure it out and realize that they have stuff that other people don't, and they should use it, use that access. Use that capability of gaining resources, and then help their neighbors, help everyone else, right? If we're going to make that equal playing ground for everybody, to everybody have that same starting place where they can accomplish whatever they want depending on how hard they work into it, then we actually have to make it, and white people have to step up and do it. So, you know, that's my take on that. So the fourth part of the exercise that I was discussing is this. What are some of the ways that white privilege is expressed? So, you know, you can take this subject or one of the other three and then write about it in the discussion and tell me, what do you think about this? You know, and then post on somebody else's that, you know, what do you think about it? So these are, again, some examples. We've talked a little bit about this, but like going shopping and being followed, you know, not having race to be concerned, dealing with like financial concerns, seeing how your race might be represented on the news or in media. And then that also includes like interpretations, like movies, you know, and there have been a number of movies that have come out that have, you know, whitewashed a storyline, including, you know, like a white actor in place of someone else. So that can be like a huge issue. Having your race represented as teachers in education, as faculty, right? You know, what happens when all you see are white faces as your professors? And I have experienced this myself because that's how most of the universities are. So, you know, you do get this whitewash of education that takes place. You know, not having to be harassed, you know, because of your skin color by the police, right? And not having to worry about, you know, being pulled over or being arrested, driving while black, or bird watching while black, or jogging while black. All of these different things that would be normalized behavior, right? That's that white privilege we're talking about, where it's not anything special, it's just normal behavior, but then it becomes something else, you know, when you don't have access to it. You know, there are a ton of different examples, and I'm looking forward to seeing what some of your ideas are when discussing these. One of the other issues that we can talk about as well is race and class. Okay, race and class are big issues because even if you are capable of climbing up that ladder, right? If you're a person of color and you are successful and you do gain some wealth or some notoriety of some type, there are still stigmas and there are still stereotypes that go along with racial identity. And we see this on a regular basis when you see politicians, when you see people of color that are politicians that are, you know, harassed after being pulled over, or are looking at, again, like, you know, how did they earn their money, or that sort of like accessibility and stuff like that. And it's again ridiculous that it happens, but you know, at every class level there's still discrimination that's taking place. So we have to sort of address those issues. So as a conclusion to all of this, you know, let's just go over some of these points. Anthropologists see no difference between the races. There is one race. It is the human race. That is it. Case closed. We do understand that through culture, we organize things differently, right? We organize the world around us, and we use our mental maps in doing this. So we have to understand how people and communities and cultures organize these different subjects. There are multiple types of racism, the individual racism, where you can take action that is negative against someone, or inaction, which is negative. So there's that. There's microaggressions. Microaggressions are, small normalized acts that don't seem like it's that big of a deal, but can be that big of a deal. And then you've got institutionalized racism, which is much more not only insidious, but behind the scenes. It's invisible oftentimes. It can be big things that have taken place over years and years and years that have become normalized. So, and it is still one of the major roadblocks in how we address racism. Racial ideology, how we normalize that behavior, how we accept it as okay. It's how we accepted slavery as being an okay thing to do, right? We normalized it. And so when we deal with ideology, we have to, if we're examining a procedure or something like that, if we're examining a policy, we have to look at it like, how has this been internalized? How do people see this kind of behavior on a normal basis? Then we talked about microaggressions, white privilege. White privilege is, something, again, that is more about normal behavior, normalized behavior that a white population might have access to, but where people of color might not have access to it. They might not be able to behave in a normal way, because if they do, there could be dire consequences, right? So, privilege, privilege oftentimes gives it the wrong context, I think. It's really about normalized behavior. What we accept as normal for white people to do and have access to has been limited by these racial practices and or racist practices and racist policies that have been put into place, and again, had been continual through history. And while I've spent like the last couple hours talking about all of this stuff that is negative, and it's like, man, like, what the crap? There is hope. Like, we have done so much in the last 160 years since slavery, right? We have done so much. And we've gotten to a point where, we've got a whole bunch of laws that have been passed that creates equality. We're getting better in so many different ways, towards equality and justice and all that stuff. And what it's going to take is, for more good people to do more good things and to create more inclusivity, and really help our neighbors, that we would help anyone, and I think that's the important thing that, this country is doing, is that, racism is disappearing. It might be at a slow rate, but it's happening. That we have more and more kids that are growing up, learning about diversity and learning about equality and all of these things. And these are all, great things to hope for. And we'll eventually get there. I believe that. Unless we're, all killed off in the pandemic, or there's a, super volcano that explodes, or, giant meteorite from, outer space that wipes us out, murder hornets. There's hope. There is hope that all of this stuff will, come about, and we'll actually get somewhere, further than where we are now. And I believe that absolutely. So I think if we look at, hi buddy. I think if we look at how anthropologists would see this, right? How anthropology deals with racism, I think we look at it from all different sides, try and understand the process behind it, right? How was race constructed? How was racism conducted? What's the historical component? What are the components that we don't see on a regular basis? How are things sort of normalized with, even like birth certificates, right? That's the first thing that we are exposed to when it comes to race, and how do we, use the census to distribute representatives to the government, and how do we address education, and how do we get other types of education out there? I mean, for goodness sakes, I've known students, I've had students myself that didn't realize that Native Americans were still alive because they were taught in some history class about Native Americans in a historical past tense, like they no longer existed, and it's like, wow. I mean, is that even possible? And it is. So education is so absolutely important. So educate your friends and educate your family about, ideology, and start thinking about yourself and how your own biases have been created by and attribute to other ideologies, right? How do you impact all of this? Think about that. Think about your space in this realm, right? And what's going on and what's being said, and pay attention to the news. Pay attention how people are being portrayed. Pay attention to the TV shows that you watch or the music that you listen to, and what's being said, and who's saying it, and what's the response. You start paying attention to all of those things, and you're going to start picking up the hows and the whys. Why do we behave the way that we do? Why are we facing some seriously like existential crises right now, in our society? Unlike any other time, we are facing some serious stuff. So think about it. Think about your place in all of this. So there's a great movie on Netflix called The 13th. That's going to be a part of the homework assignment. Watch it. It is fantastic. It is a great film. Also, I want you to do homework assignment, standard homework assignment, reflection paper, reflect upon what we've covered today, in these lectures. And then discussion. Pick one of the 4 questions that we've listed, and then use that, and springboard off of that and talk about what you think, and then, comment on 2 other people's discussions. And yeah. And also, go out and vote, right? Vote. Please vote. Your voice matters. Get your parents to vote. Get your grandparents to vote. Get your friends to vote. I've got friends that are like, I'm not voting. My voice doesn't count. I am hounding them. It's like, I don't care what you vote about. I do care about what you vote about. But you need to go out and vote, right? You need to use your voice, because here's the thing, if you want decency back in the world, if you want good things to be, normalized again and not have to worry every day about some new scandal that's going to take place, you need to vote. You need to, raise your voice and put your opinion out there and try and make a difference. So I encourage all of you to vote and to use your voice. It's the only way that we will be able to change the world to the way that we want to change it to. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk to you all later. I hope you all have a great week. I haven't seen all of the midterms turned in yet. So, but, you know, I'm recording this prior to when probably most of you do your midterms. So I'm hoping that you guys did well. So yeah, keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you next week. Okay? Stay safe, stay healthy, go vote. We'll talk to you soon. All right.